Hey everybody, it's Tom. I'm the community builder at Safe Landing. I just wanted to take this quick opportunity to introduce the talk that you're about to see, as well as extend an invitation to yourselves as well. Now, the talk you're about to see, it genuinely is fantastic. I find sometimes the topic of net zero can be quite dense to get into, but what Katie achieves in the talk through the use of metaphors, some fun facts, and some really interesting anecdotes as well, is she makes it really relatable, really grounded. There's something for everybody in there. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is if you like what you see here, and if you consider yourself someone who you love travel or you work in aviation, but you're also concerned about the future of our planet and indeed the future of our industry, then please do get involved. You're very welcome to join the Safe Landing community. It's dead easy. Just go to safe-landing.org, and on the front page there you can see to sign up. And when you do sign up, you'll get loads of reminders for our upcoming talks, other events, as well as invitations occasionally in how you could get involved as well. So I think that's all from me for now. Hope you're having a fantastic day so far and enjoyed the talk.
Hey everybody, and to those of you just joining, we'll just run through the introduction of Safe Landing and give a chance for a few more people to join, and then I'll pass over to the main event, Katie's talk today. So welcome, my name's Tom. I'm the community builder at Safe Landing. Before working at Safe Landing, I was a commercial pilot for British Airways for 9 years and in the Air Force before that, so absolutely plane mad. And welcome, if you haven't heard of Safe Landing before, we're a community of aviation workers and enthusiasts, a global community, as shown by people from all over the world joining this one. So thanks for making the effort. And our group, we have a purpose and a vision, and our purpose is we connect and empower people so that together we create a better future for all. And our vision, what would we like to see? Well, we want to live in a world where aviation flourishes in harmony with nature and the beauty of flying can be enjoyed by all for generations to come. So hopefully that's resonating with lots of you in the chat. And if we get a tiny bit of time at the end, I'll add in a couple of Safe Landing links and ways you can join and get involved. How are we doing for numbers, Finley? Do you reckon it's good enough to kick off?
Yeah, we've got 16, so let's go for it.
Brilliant. Well, we didn't give up our lunch times to listen to me witter on, so I'm going to pass very quickly over to Katie and her talk. All I'm going to say is Katie is also a member of Safe Landing. She joined 8 or 9 months ago. You can tell me if I'm wrong. And she's been to loads of meetings since, and I'm very, very grateful that she's agreed to give up her time to do this talk for all of us today. So Katie, whenever you're ready, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Great to be here. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard Safe Landing Flight 101 to Aviation Climate Literacy. I'm Katie Thompson, your captain for the next hour. Buckle your seatbelts, we've got a bit of a bumpy ride ahead. As a pilot, I flew enormous airliners, private jets and small piston aircraft, even seaplanes. And when I wasn't working in the cockpit, I was that enthusiastic, clapping upon landing kind of passenger. Boarding an airplane always felt very normal. It was just what I did, almost daily. As I started to get concerned about climate change, I chose not to ask difficult questions about flying. I recycled, I cleaned up beaches, and I changed my eating habits, but I still had a blind spot when it came to my love of aviation. As well as flying, I transitioned into management as the head of flight safety for NetJets. I was now in charge of assessing the risks to our operations and trying to find ways to avoid them, looking for the future problems and trying to prevent them from happening. So jumping from safety to sustainability seemed like a very natural progression. But whereas safety management is about preventing an accident that will impact a small number of people, the climate crisis, whether we realize it yet or not, is going to directly impact all of our lives. And for many people, it already has. When I decided to go back to university in 2023 to take a master's in sustainable air transport management, my aim was to find a job in an airline sustainability team and be part of the solution, hopefully flying around the world in comfort as I did it. But things did not go as planned. Instead, I'm setting up a nonprofit with a talented team of climate volunteers to harness passenger power in order to help drive reform in the aviation industry. It's called Bumprints, and we are launching this month. The talk today is Net Zero by 2050, a realistic goal or industry greenwashing. So my work to date has been talking to climate people about aviation and helping climate conscious passengers understand how to minimize the impact of every flight. So this is a new audience for me, but such an exciting and important one because as aviation workers, you have the ability to help shape the lasting legacy of the industry. So wherever you are in your climate journey, I want to thank you for showing up today. We are all in a very uncomfortable period of transition as we start waking up at different speeds to the reality of the accelerating climate crisis. It is a very understandable reaction to want to roll over, close your eyes, and pretend it is not happening. And this transition is especially hard when it threatens not only your lifestyle, but also your professional identity and your livelihood. Because I'm pretty sure that, like me, you chose to work in aviation because it was an industry that you could feel good about. This is one of the first pictures we ever saw of our planet, taken in 1972. One of the first real images of the beautiful, fragile, finite home that we all share and all need to protect. So the aim of this session is to talk about aviation's role in the climate crisis and to look at how the aviation industry is tackling the problem. I'm going to start with a very simple overview of the climate crisis, just so we are all on the same page, and then look at how aviation specifically is contributing to it. Then we'll talk about what aviation's commitment to net zero means and how the industry is planning on achieving it. And hopefully we'll have time for lots of questions and comments. As a pilot, of course I understood that airplanes cause pollution, but the sky seems so vast and forgiving, surely it would just all blow away. This photo is taken from the International Space Station, and it's showing us the troposphere, which is the thin sliver of our atmosphere that contains the air we breathe, almost all of our weather. It's where most of our flying takes place, and also where all the greenhouse gases are trapped. It's only on average about 12 kilometers high. You literally could walk to the top of it in about 2 hours. Oh God. Sorry. Okay, so sunlight passes through this thin layer and is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. And some of the heat is reflected back into space. But some of the heat is trapped in our atmosphere by the greenhouse gases. And these gases play a really important role, and they're what has made our planet so pleasant to live on. It's the only planet we know that can support life, and it's sometimes called a Goldilocks planet because it's neither too hot nor too cold. It's just right for the plants and the animals that live here. And while there are several greenhouse gases, to keep things simple, we're going to talk about carbon dioxide. A certain amount of carbon has been harmoniously cycling through our atmosphere for billions of years. But then we discovered fossil fuels, the excess carbon that had been naturally captured and removed from our atmosphere. And we started putting it back into the atmosphere and at a progressively faster rate. And at the same time, we started reducing the ability of the planet to keep removing carbon from the atmosphere by not protecting the natural resources like our rainforests that are a vital part of the balanced carbon cycle. And so as a result, the carbon dioxide concentration has been increasing, causing more and more outgoing radiation to be trapped, and our planet's thermostat is getting turned up higher and higher. Basically, we have just overwhelmed the natural carbon cycle. What we're looking at here is monthly global temperature deviations from a long-term average. And the good news is that as a global community, we have come together and decided we must stop global warming. And this decision is documented by the Paris Agreement, which is the international treaty on climate change, whose initial goal was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. But after intense negotiations led primarily by small island nations, it was agreed to set an aspirational goal to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But international aviation, which represents 65% of all aviation emissions, were not included in the Paris Agreement. And most countries also largely ignore them in their emission reductions targets. So why is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius important? It's because scientists have agreed that this is the temperature boundary which will protect us from the worst consequences of climate change, and especially protect the most vulnerable people, places, and ecosystems. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming is literally the difference between those small island nations disappearing off the map, as well as the acceleration of all of these other threats to our planet. And climate change is not only a biophysical threat, but it's also a threat multiplier that will make other problems worse. And so there are many socio-economic consequences to allowing temperatures to keep rising. And these are consequences that many people are already experiencing. So, what is aviation's contribution to all this? Well, of course, airlines release a lot of carbon. Every kilo of jet fuel releases over 3 kilos of carbon. But aviation is facing a double whammy. As well as adding significant amounts of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere, aircraft also create heat-trapping contrails. So let's look at each of these in turn. So for at least the past 800,000 years, the carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere was under 300 parts per million. After the 1900s, the concentration started increasing slowly and then more and more rapidly. So this graph is from 2023, where the concentration had reached 421 parts per million. And the scientists say that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to limit carbon dioxide to 450 parts per million. So where are we today? As of May 2025, we had surpassed 430. So just take a second to calculate how long you think we have left before we hit the critical boundary of 450 parts per million, where we surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right? About 4 years. And of course, we are all desperately hoping for technological breakthroughs. There are brilliant engineers and scientists hard at work every day trying to find solutions, but there is no quick fix, and innovation in aviation is particularly slow, and rightfully so because of safety. So an important fact to keep in mind when we're talking about net zero is that even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases today, this would only stop, hopefully stop, the temperature rising. Net zero is not the solution, it's only the emergency brake. But it is an important first step. So net zero is like turning off the taps. The bath is overflowing and the cleanup hasn't started yet. But if our bath is overflowing, the first thing we have to do is turn off the taps. So how's that going for aviation? What we're looking at here is carbon emissions over time from international aviation. The black line is the historical emissions. You can see the COVID dip, which made the trend harder to predict accurately for a few years. Aviation emissions were actually looking quite good for a couple of years, but not anymore. The industry has bounced back from the pandemic, and the skyrocketing blue line represents the path ahead for aviation based on current policies and actions. To be aligned with the Paris Agreement's temperature goals, aviation emissions need to peak this year and reduce by at least 90% by 2050. But as this data shows us, instead of starting to turn off the taps, the aviation industry is continuing to open them. The color-coded legend on the right warns us that aviation is about to overshoot even the critically insufficient grey sector, which is in line with a plus 4 degree Celsius warmer world. And maybe you've heard people saying that flying only accounts for a tiny 2.5% of global emissions. And this is normally followed by a statement about how environmentalists should focus their attention on other larger climate problems and leave the relatively harmless aviation industry and its frequent flyers alone. So, for example, this is the UK's Transport Minister, Heidi Alexander, defending the UK's massive planned airport expansions. But talking about it as a percentage of global emissions overlooks the fact that air travel is not a global privilege. In fact, only 20% of the world has ever flown. So if we dig a little deeper and look at flying emissions in countries that enjoy mature aviation markets like the UK, then the numbers look quite different. According to the UK government's own climate change committee, in 2025, aviation will account for almost 9% of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions. This graph from the same government committee shows us that by 2040, the picture will be very different again. By 2040, aviation, which is the purple line on this graph, will have become the highest emitting sector in the UK, competing with agriculture for that top position and responsible for a staggering 27% of total UK emissions. And as it battles it out with agriculture, remember that everyone has to eat, whereas aviation can be considered a luxury good and one that is mostly enjoyed by a very small privileged percentage of the population. And this data, by the way, does not even include the increased emissions from the proposed airport expansions in the UK. It's also very important to understand that carbon emissions only account for about 1/3 of the overall warming impact of aviation, because we have to talk about non-CO2 effects. So apart from emitting carbon dioxide, aircraft engines also leave behind water vapor, soot, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides, which all alter the composition of our atmosphere and can create artificial heat trapping clouds. And together these are referred to as the non-CO2 effects. And the climate impact of these are more difficult to accurately measure. And as you can see from the red and blue arrows on the chart, they can be warming or cooling. And because it's complicated, it's easy for the aviation industry to delay action by insisting that they need more accurate data. And while contrails look pretty during the day, during the night they act like blankets over our planet that trap in even more heat. Contrails only form in certain atmospheric conditions, and as a result there are problem areas where long-lasting, warming contrails are far more likely to form. Unfortunately, the main problem areas coincide with the airspace where most of our flying takes place: Europe, North America, and over the North Atlantic, one of the world's busiest nocturnal flight corridors. So contrails are a visual reminder of the climate price of flying. If only they looked more polluting instead of normally brilliant white. Perhaps then they would provoke more concern and less admiration. They have started to attract more attention, and some studies and trials are underway. And these are showing that small changes in routing and altitude can sometimes prevent contrail formation. So, this is a promising development. But so just to sum up, in addition to the carbon dioxide problem, we also have a bigger non-CO2 problem to solve. And in order to be able to estimate the overall climate impact of flying, we need to use a multiplier to the carbon emission metrics when we're talking about this. And unsurprisingly, there's a significant disagreement about what multiplier to use. The UK government is currently using a factor of 1.9, whereas some scientists currently consider the correct figure to be more like 2.7. And of course, there are very strong and vocal vested interests at play here. What does IATA, the International Air Transport Association, say? They say more data is needed. Now, only 11% of the world flies in any given year, and this graphic shows that over 80% of the world have never even stepped foot on an aircraft, and that just 1% of the global population is causing half of the global warming caused by air travel. So what do we think this non-flying 80% of the world's population represents? To the airline industry, it represents an exciting untapped market. literally hundreds of billions of dollars. So the demand for travel is growing annually by 8.8%, and passenger numbers are predicted to triple by 2050. So most of us here come from places with mature aviation markets, like Europe and the United States. But look at the largest region for growth in 2023, Asia Pacific. Emerging markets like India, for example, are trying to catch up with the global north. Only 1% of Indians have ever flown internationally, but the new middle class in India is ready to take to the skies. There are 50 new airports under construction in India, and Indian airlines have ordered over 1,000 new commercial aircraft since 2023. And to just quickly touch on climate justice, who are we in the countries who have been responsible for the historical buildup of most of these emissions to say that Indians shouldn't be entitled to the same access to air travel that we enjoy, especially as we are still growing our own markets? And while we're talking about buying new aircraft, this is a snapshot of a busy day in 2023. Today, there are about 28,000 commercial airliners in operation worldwide, and over the next 20 years, Airbus forecasts a demand for over 42,000 more, the majority of which are not replacing older aircraft, but are new additional aircraft. And every single one of these aircraft is designed to still be flying on emissions-producing fuel, and each one will have a lifespan of at least 25 years. But don't worry, because ICAO, who is the UN body that has the responsibility to work with countries to limit or reduce the emissions from international flights, and IATA, which is the trade association that represents 340 airlines, as well as numerous individual airlines, have all committed to the ambitious goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So this means that they have pledged to reduce their emissions as much as possible, and whatever they can't reduce, they will remove from the atmosphere. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this goal does not address non-CO2 effects, and also that achieving net zero will not leave us with a pristine planet. It's just turning off the tap. It also does nothing to address the CO2 that all the airlines are planning to keep releasing into our atmosphere between now and 2050. So they're just saying that by 2050, they will start taking out as much as they put in. So having looked at several of the net zero roadmaps, the available actions can pretty much be simplified into three main areas, which are burn less fuel, change the fuel, and remove carbon. So let's talk about burning less fuel. Because the main problem isn't flying, it's burning emission-producing fuel. So the first logical step is to burn as little fuel as possible. And of course, fuel efficiency is not a new focus. Jet fuel has always been the biggest single cost of any airline, making up over 1/3 of all operating costs. But to burn the least amount of fuel per passenger, airlines need to fly the lightest, most modern aircraft with the most passengers on board in the most direct and fuel-efficient way. So we're going to talk about fleet renewal and weight reduction, and if I had more time, I would also talk a little bit about airspace modernization, but we don't have time. So fleet renewal. Buying new modern aircraft is a great way for an airline to burn less fuel. Each new generation of aircraft is more fuel efficient than the last. But as aircraft become more efficient, the price of a passenger ticket drops and more people fly. So the blue line on this graph shows how the amount of fuel burnt per kilometer reduces with each new generation of aircraft. But the blue line is flattening out because there's only so much we can do to reduce fuel burn. Whereas the yellow line represents the growth in passenger kilometers over the same time period. Notice that that one's not flattening out, it's actually steepening. So in the last 30 years, as aircraft have become twice as efficient, demand has quadrupled. So as a result, total emissions have doubled. Let's look at a more recent example. So this is a screenshot from the 2024 British Airways Sustainability Report. The text underlined in yellow reassures us that their newer aircraft are 20 to 35% more efficient than the ones they replace. But can you see the problem here? They have retired 3 aircraft, but they have added 13 new ones. And what happens when airlines retire these gas-guzzling older aircraft? They are off the airline's sustainability balance sheet, but are they being responsibly disposed of, or instead are they being sold on to airlines in the global south or cargo airlines to continue contributing to global emissions for many years to come? This jumbo jet, one of the last Boeing 747s, is still flying in Iran. It was originally part of an order made by United Airlines in 1990, 35 years ago. United wouldn't touch it with a barge pole now, but it is still up there and it's still flying. And as aircraft have become increasingly more fuel efficient, airline costs have gone down, and these savings have been passed on to the passengers in the form of cheaper tickets, which in turn has made flying more affordable to more people. Aviation is heavily subsidized, from airports to airline manufacturers to some airlines, and jet fuel is also largely untaxed. And most aircraft emissions are also not subjected to a carbon price. So this all helps to keep the price of flying artificially low, and it gives air travel an unfair competitive edge over other lower carbon methods of public transportation. Okay, let's go back to the British Airways Sustainability Report. So on the next page, British Airways shows us this reassuring graph of their annual carbon emissions decreasing year on year. This metric, decreasing carbon emissions per passenger, is the one that the airlines love to talk about. But we know by now that emissions per passenger is only half of the story. This is the graph you want to look at. It's not such a reassuring picture. This is the total emissions from their flights, and they don't like talking about this metric as much. And don't forget about the multiplier to account for the non-CO2 effects, but I couldn't find any reference to that here. Here's another airline, Wizz, who are an ultra-cost, low-cost carrier with the newest fleet in Europe, and who seem to be scooping up all the sustainability awards. As far as airlines go, they are pretty good. I like their messaging, and they claim not to compete with train journeys that can be done in under 4 hours, which is commendable. And look, another reassuring downward trending emission graph, boasting a 25% reduction in emissions intensity. But if we look a little bit closer, we can see a similar pattern. The emissions per passenger, RPK, have decreased from 2023 to 2024. But the overall emissions have gone up by almost 1 million tons. Why? Because they're expanding like crazy. But here I did find a reference to the multiplier for non-CO2 effects. They have gone with a modest 1.7, which acts to increase the total emissions by another 4 million tons of CO2. Remember that scientists are now recommending a multiplier of 2.7. So, apart from buying the newest aircraft, or at least waiting in line as there is such a huge backlog of orders, what else can airlines do in order to burn less fuel? Well, there are lots of things. Washing the aircraft and engines more often to reduce drag, taxiing on only one engine and only starting the other engine just before takeoff, and also trying to remove all the excess non-essential weight on board. It obviously takes an enormous amount of energy to get a large aircraft off the ground and to climb all the way up to cruising altitude. And the bigger and heavier the aircraft is, the more fuel it burns. Every additional kilo of weight on board increases the fuel burn. So unsurprisingly, airlines are focused on reducing the weight on board their aircraft. Here are some examples of how they're doing that. Thinner seats, smaller toilets, and the ever-shrinking carry-on baggage allowance. But as economy seating becomes lighter by the day, what happens if you turn left for luxury when you board the aircraft? In the first and business class sections, there are countless examples of how some airlines are prioritizing profit over fuel savings. And most of these full-service airlines are busy expanding their luxury offerings. So these seats take up a lot of valuable space and add enormous unnecessary weight. They vary from large armchairs to spacious closed suites. They come with extra luxuries like onboard bars and prayer rooms and spa showers and gourmet meals and pajamas and binoculars and masseuses. And alongside all these services and products come a higher ratio of flight attendants to passengers, more generous baggage allowances, wider aisles, and more larger exclusive use toilets. So the result is more fuel burn is spread over fewer passengers. And so ultimately, significantly more aircraft need to be flown on every route. So if airlines are trying to figure out some quick available actions to help them reduce their climate impact, I would suggest this would be a very good place to start, at least until some of the other future solutions that we're going to discuss become available to them. Let's talk about Swiss, the national airline of Switzerland. As their economy seats have gotten lighter and lighter, Swiss has installed such heavy first-class seats that they have caused balancing problems in their Airbus A330 aircraft. The centre of gravity, which has to be kept within a certain range for safety, has shifted too far forward. The airline response was not to lighten the first-class offerings or even to add some improvements to the economy section, but instead they decided to counterbalance the first-class section by installing 1.5 tons of lead plates in the tail of the aircraft. And we mustn't forget private jets. 40% of these flights are flown empty to pick up passengers. They create up to 40 times more emissions per passenger, and most of the flights are very short, less than 500 kilometers, which are distances that could easily often be covered by road or rail. And now there are even private jet companies specifically targeting dogs. So there's Barcare in the US and K9 in the UK. Okay, so once we've decided to burn less fuel, we also need to change the fuel. And so the biggest part of the net zero plan is changing the energy source. And like I said, there's brilliant people hard at work trying to find alternative sources of energy that will allow us to keep flying. And the airlines are gambling on these solutions becoming available, tested, certified, and implemented at the enormous scale necessary in time to meet their net zero by 2050 pledge. So we're going to talk about 3 of these. I don't know about you, but my brain turns off when people start talking about hydrocarbons. So I find it easier to compare fuels to foods because they're both energy sources. So planes need fuel like humans need food, and we need different kinds of food depending on what we're hoping to achieve. But just like people, aviation also needs to change its diet. So fossil-based jet fuel or kerosene would be the food equivalent of steak. Both are very efficient sources of energy, but our overconsumption of both are having serious environmental consequences. We need to consume less of them, and greener alternatives are needed. So-called sustainable aviation fuel could be compared to a veggie burger, a simple meat substitute that provides a similar amount of calories. Depending on what it's made out of and how it's cooked, a veggie burger can be a better environmental choice than a steak. And airlines claim that by using sustainable aviation fuel instead of kerosene, they could reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel by up to 80%. They see it as their silver sustainability bullet, and its use makes up a whopping 65% of IATA's net zero by 2050 roadmap. And the key environmental benefit of SAF is that it does not add any new fossil fuel emissions into our atmosphere. Instead, SAF is made from recycling the carbon that already exists above the ground in various forms. And it can be made from many different ingredients, including used cooking oil and animal fat from slaughterhouses, forestry and agricultural waste, sewage, and even carbon captured straight from the air. But it can only be considered sustainable, or SAF, if the raw ingredients used to make it are sustainably sourced, as well as the processes used to produce it, and to transport it to the aircraft. And all the feedstocks required to make SAF are scarce, as well as the renewable energy needed for the production process. And additionally, there are several other industries who are also trying to decarbonize and who also need access to the same limited raw materials and resources. And aviation's net zero plan does not seem to have considered this. There are also legitimate concerns about the land use change required to produce SAF at the enormous scale needed, and that its use may cause more deforestation and habitat destruction, as well as competing with food production. To date, not nearly enough SAF has been made to make any difference to total aviation emissions, which, as we have seen, continue to rise. So this diagram shows IATA's SAF targets over time. It's from a sobering study called Missed Targets, which chronicles how far the aviation industry has been from ever meeting any of its SAF targets. So for example, in 2007, IATA set a goal for 10% of the global aviation fuel supply to come from SAF by 2017. This target, along with all the next targets, was quietly abandoned, and in 2024, still only 0.3% of the aircraft fuel supply was SAF. And in 2024, the same year, the total amount of jet fuel used increased by 2%. So SAF production is not even compensating for the increased fuel burn associated with industry growth. So is net zero by 2050 just one more missed target for aviation? But this is crucial to understand. If you burn so-called sustainable aviation fuel, the emissions coming out the back of the engine are exactly the same as with jet fuel. And burning SAF will keep adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when we really need to be drawing it out and storing it away permanently. So, for example, Virgin Atlantic has been instructed to stop using the term sustainable aviation fuel as an advertising slogan because a significant proportion of the public wrongly understood that it means that this fuel has no negative environmental impact. And Virgin Atlantic confirmed to the Advertising Standards Agency that SAF produces the same level of CO2 as traditional jet fuel. So, electric. Flying on batteries would be the fuel equivalent of watermelons. Like batteries, watermelons take up a lot of space and are very heavy to carry around. You also wouldn't be able to run very far or fast on a diet of watermelons. Electric and hybrid electric aircraft are starting to be used in flight training and should be shortly available for limited passenger flights. These will be a good solution for very short regional flights, like connecting an island to the mainland. Private jet flights, the greediest jet fuel consumers, could also benefit from shifting to a diet of watermelon. This is Heart Aerospace. They're currently developing a 30-seater aircraft with an all-electric range of 200 kilometers with 30 passengers on board. And while these solutions are promising, they would largely apply only to short-haul flights. And according to the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT, electric aircraft will only reduce 0.2% of the expected emissions from passenger flying in 2050. Hydrogen. Burning hydrogen as a fuel is the equivalent of eating popcorn. To get enough calories from popcorn, you will need to eat mountains of it. Similarly, the fuel tanks on the airplane, which are currently in the wings, would need to be 4 times bigger if flying on liquid hydrogen. Hydrogen has been receiving a lot of attention and investment as an exciting alternative to jet fuel. But the volume of liquid hydrogen is not only 4 times greater than jet fuel, but it also has very different handling and combustion requirements. So as a result, both the shape of the aircraft and its engines will need to be completely redesigned before we can safely fly on hydrogen. This will take many years. For example, Airbus has been working on designing a hydrogen-powered commercial aircraft since 2020, the Zero E project. Originally planned for use from 2035, it has recently been pushed back at least 5 to 10 years. So as a result, it will probably not be playing a significant role in decarbonising aviation by 2050. Another enormous challenge to flying on hydrogen is its storage needs. Hydrogen fuel needs to be cryogenically stored at minus 253 degrees Celsius, both at the airport and on the aircraft. And in addition, the distribution network to get it into the airports is also non-existent. So it's not hard to understand why prominent experts say hydrogen is a dead-end solution. So the third pillar of the net zero plans is carbon removal. Because even using every option available today and all the future solutions that the industry is counting on, it's easy to see that airlines will not be able to eliminate all their carbon emissions. So as a result, carbon removal is a necessary part of the plan. Carbon offsetting projects have been around for a very long time. They used to be a philanthropic way for companies to help restore degraded forests, wetlands. And while this is vitally necessary and important, over time they've become seen as a way to justify a company growing its emissions and an acceptable alternative to actually tackling pollution at its source. So British Airways, again, sorry, I'm picking on you, British Airways. They are actually the airline that buys the most carbon offsets in the UK, but they recently announced a large investment in enhanced rock weathering, which is a process that sprinkles crushed up rocks on the ground to capture and store carbon dioxide. However, this will only compensate for about 0.02% of the airline's current emissions. So in reality, many of these projects, like planting trees and providing clean cooking stoves, have failed to deliver lasting results. The CEO of Wizz has called carbon offsets a bit of a joke, and the CEO of United referred to them as a fraud, going on to describe them as either forests that were never going to be cut down or trees that were going to be planted anyway. Nevertheless, ICAO, who's meant to be running the program here, their biggest contribution to decarbonising aviation is an offsetting scheme, CORSIA. I won't go into it because we're running out of time, but Transport and Environment has referred to it as the worst option for the climate. So it's a very weak solution that they're proposing. And there are concerns about ICAO. So ICAO lacks transparency, which allows the aviation industry to privately influence climate negotiations and push for their vested interests without external scrutiny. And according to Influence Map, who are a think tank that look at climate lobbying, they have said this: the level of access and potential influence given to fossil fuel and aviation industries by ICAO is extremely concerning. And the final part of the strategy that the airlines are planning on using is carbon capture for everything that they can't either stop emitting or offset. And I really want to feel optimistic about carbon capture, but like most of the other solutions I've covered today, it's not even close to being ready at the enormous scale required. And even IATA admits that carbon capture is still a distant and unproven option. And there's also a really sinister element with carbon capture, because fossil fuel companies are now receiving huge grants to clean up the pollution that they have already profited from causing. And they're even using some of the captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery to boost further oil production. So, at the end of the day, the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions is to start making less of them. And pursuing growth at any environmental cost seems a very short-sighted strategy for the airline industry. A significantly warmer world will not encourage much travel and tourism. Flooded coastal cities and submerged tropical islands, snowless ski resorts, far more frequent heat waves, increased global security, all this will impact people's desire to travel. But don't worry, because the airlines are going to help you to keep flying. For example, Brussels Airlines, among others, are now trying to sell coolcations because the places we used to want to travel to are just getting too hot in the summers. So we seem to be in the teenage years when it comes to the aviation industry. And I'm a mother of teenagers. And my teenagers act like we do not have to live within a budget. And they fight relentlessly against any rules or curfews that will curtail their freedom, even when it's clearly in their own or the family's best interest. And aviation is behaving in a similar way, by ignoring the need for carbon budget, by lobbying fiercely against any but the very weakest environmental restrictions, by downplaying the science and using various tactics to delay taking any action. To me, they seem to be using the tactics straight out of the big tobacco and big oil playbook. So I think you already know what I think, but I would love to hear what you think. So the question we started with is aviation's net zero by 2050 a realistic goal or a greenwashing exercise? And I've compiled some resources that I used to make this presentation, which I've given to Tom, so I don't know if he can share that in the chat. And then also a QR code to my new venture where we would love you to come and connect with us and follow us. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie, for your time. I will open it up also with the open question.